touched his heart a lot. He hated to see them in that condition. So while he wasn't actually working for George Washington and fighting on the side of on the side of the Federalists here against the British, he was working towards the emancipation of the African American slaves that he saw, courtesy of his trusted friend and companion, Agrippa Holt. That might be his name. It might not be. I may be pronouncing it wrong, but forgive me. My memory isn't really as sharp as it should be. And I just really started studying him. It just really recently that I kind of got in depth with his story, because his story is fascinating. Because I always thought that every soldier that fought here in America were coming from the colonies of England. So I thought that the people who were actually fighting against the British were all from those England colonies. But it comes to find out that a lot of people were coming from different places to help America fight the Revolutionary War to keep the British out. That's something that and that this Polish guy, he really caught my attention, and his story caught my attention for whatever reasons. There's this woman that I used to work for, one of the nicest employers that I've ever had, and she was Polish, and that was the reason why I started studying Poland, because I heard about Poland when I studied Western civilization in college, and my instructor was talking to us, the whole class, about how Poland was brought into World War II because of the German invasion of Adolf Hitler, and how he attacked Warsaw and I believe Krakow. He attacked the whole country. But because of that, I knew a little bit about Poland, and I knew a little bit about the city, but I never studied it in depth. So as of recently, I started studying it in depth, maybe about a year now. Started studying Poland, and kind of fell in love with Poland. I like Poland, the city of Warsaw. One of these days, I'll get the opportunity to go travel there and see what Poland is like, as well as many other European countries. I really do like those European countries. I like the architecture of the buildings and the land. I don't know, something about Europe makes me interested in it. But anyway, so the one thing that stood out about Thaddeus Kosicucko, the one thing that stood out about his life and his tenure here in America while he was fighting the Revolutionary War was the fact that he was a friend to African Americans, and he was fighting for their emancipation. Now, he wrote a will, and the will that he wrote, his last testament, was given to Thomas Jefferson. And he was supposed to exact the will because, from my knowledge of his studies, of him, he didn't have any next of kin. He didn't have any children. And from a little bit more further into the studies that I've studied about him, he didn't have a wife either. He didn't have a spouse. So he gave his estate and all the money that he did have, which was a lot of money back then. And today we would look at it as being peanuts. But a lot of money back then he gave to, he wrote a will, and the last testament and will that he wrote, he gave to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was supposed to execute the will. Now, in the will, the surprising thing about the will is this is one of the most interesting parts of the story about Thaddeus Kosicucko, or Kosicucko, which however you want to pronounce it, was that he left everything to Thomas Jefferson to give to his companion, Agrippa Holt, and the African Americans who he had in his care. He actually left everything to the African Americans, which was unheard of back then in his time, because the African American wasn't looked at as being even human back then by white Americans and Europeans. They were seen as slaves. They were seen as property. So the fact that he gave, just to show you how dedicated he was to the emancipation of African Americans. So I read a little bit. I read the will itself, and it was passionate. What he wanted to do was he wanted to give his property to them. He wanted to see to it that the money that he had went towards their education and their well-being and their caretaking. And then he signed it, and he gave it to Thomas Jefferson. Now, for whatever reasons, this may be a discrepancy in the story with people who back Thomas Jefferson. I wasn't living back then, so please do not hate on me because of whatever perspective or perception you have of the situation. But from what the history books say, Thomas Jefferson didn't execute that part of the will. He didn't appropriate those funds where Thaddeus wanted those funds to be appropriated, and he didn't free the slaves that were in Thaddeus's care. For whatever reasons, he didn't do that. I thought that was a unfortunate part of the story, kind of disappointing, but considering the time frame that they lived in, it's typical. It was typical. So, but going back to his service and his passion about it, it reminds me of a movie called Glory. If you've seen that movie before. And Glory had Denzel Washington as the star. And there was a part there was this commander, army commander. He was European. He was white. And he liked African Americans. He, had a regiment of African Americans under his care when they fought the Civil War. And he liked all of his soldiers. And Denzel Washington was one of his soldiers, but he was rebellious. Denzel Washington played the rebellious character, the rebellious black soldier, African American soldier, because he couldn't stand white people because of the slavery. But it was, fighting in the army was the only way that they could get out of slavery. That's the only way they could earn their freedom. So he played that part, and there was this part where Denzel Washington's character did something and violated some type of law or whatever back then and there, and the rest of the army commanders the white ones decided to punish him by whipping him and giving him lashes across his back. That was back then, that was normal. That was actually, that was the least thing that they would do to you for insubordination. But they was giving him lashes across his back, and he was standing there and he was taking the lashes, and he refused to cry. Like, he refused to yell out. He refused to scream out. The only thing he did was let one tear go. That was a theatrical blockbuster right there. I love that part, right? But he refused to do it. He refused to cry. He refused to scream out. He just stood there and took those lashes, because how he thought of it is he thought that he deserved his freedom, and he deserved that he shouldn't have to be fighting for it. They deserved care. They wasn't given better boots. They wasn't given good uniforms. They were fighting in the most terrible terrain. They were on the front line. They were taking most of the heat of the battle, and he felt like they were being used, and that they wouldn't earn their freedom anyway. So that's why he was insubordinate. So he stood there and he was taking those lashes, and he let one tear go, and his commander, the white guy, he was standing there and he was looking at it. He felt really bad about it. Really bad about it. So every time I read the story of Thaddeus Kosicucko or Kosciuszko, it reminds me of that part in the movie. It reminds me of that commander anyway, because through the whole movie, he had nothing against the African American soldier. The character in the movie, that is. He had nothing against the African American soldier. In fact, he was actually, in certain ways, because he would get in trouble for insubordination as well, for trying to help the soldiers the African American soldiers have rights in the army. He would get in trouble too by his white superiors, who used to tell him, hey man, listen, they're not even human beings. It's just basically property of ours. So quit trying to fight for them. If they die in battle, so what? If they don't have boots, so what? If they don't have the adequate uniforms, and if they're on the front line, that's what they're here for. They're here to die to save us, to save our numbers. Of course, he didn't like that. So, but it reminds me of that character. But as I'm not really, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on history at all, not by a long shot. I'm like 0.5% knowledgeable about the world and the world's history, right? I know a little bit, but I know just enough to get by. But what I would say is this: there seems to be this common thread that I see about African Americans. Even after the Civil War, before the Civil War, when African Americans were fighting for their rights in this nation and fighting to become free when they were still slaves, chattel slavery I'm speaking of, there were people who created organizations like the Underground Railroad, right? And there were slaves like Nat Turner who who rebelled against their white oppressors physically. There were individuals. The thread that I'm talking about, that I think about, that interests me the most about these common occurrences, is that there were actually white people that put themselves on the line. All white people aren't bad. All white people aren't racist. All white people aren't discriminatory. All white people are not prejudiced against black people, right? Some of that stuff you could, if you feel like white Americans or Euro Americans don't fight enough for the rights of African Americans, you could kind of chalk it up to peer pressure, right? They have superiors that they have to look up to as well, and sometimes those superiors abuse their authority, even with their own people, in the quest to push their agenda, their racist agenda. So even they have to deal with discrimination on their end because they're trying to defend individuals like myself, African Americans who just want to be free and want the same equal rights that white Americans are afforded in the Constitution. But the thing that I get perplexed about is that African Americans tend to not appreciate that. I've read in the history of America, in American history, that during the Civil War and even before the Civil War, there are many different white people, white women. There were white women who were instrumental in the fight to emancipate African American slaves. White women would actually go against white men and would help. There was one story in particular, I can't remember her name, but she hid. The Underground Railroad was in full swing, and there was a couple of slaves that ended up on her doorstep. Her husband wasn't home. She ended up letting those slaves in and letting them hide in her house. And there were some white slave catchers looking for them, right? Bounty hunters looking for them, and knocked on her door and asked her, did they come in here? We know they're in the area. Did they come in here? And she said no. She lied to them, and she told no. They didn't search the house, but she told them no. So they left, but somehow they ended up finding out that she did help them, and they hung her for that. And she willingly went to the gallows for that. She willingly went to her death. And she gave one of the most stirring testimonies before she passed away. And this happened more often than most African American or white American historians would like to talk about. It happened a lot. It happened a lot. They don't talk about it a lot. But if you're an African American and if you studied this and you know this, and you have this knowledge, even now, there would be haters that would look at this video and be like, we know this, I know this, tell me something I don't know. Tell me this. If you knew it already, how come you're not going to the African American communities amongst your brothers and telling them this? How come you're not helping them explain this? How come you're not helping them know these things? How come you're not going to them and explaining these things to them so they can appreciate it more and they can stop walking around here feeling like every white person is their enemy? Why not? I meet a lot of African Americans, man, who are angry. And they're usually the disenfranchised ones. We're all disenfranchised. But it's usually the ones who live in the most poverty-stricken areas in America. Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, certain parts of New York, etc., etc. The major urban centers with the largest amount of unemployed African Americans. And they so angry with white people. Can't stand them. I want to kill them. Black power, black pride. I'm this and I'm that. But at the same time, how much history have you done, brother? How much history have you done, sister? How much educating have you done? Do you know anything about Thaddeus Kosicucko? Do you know anything about him? How much do you know about him? How much did you know that in his will, he gave everything that he had for the cause of emancipating African Americans. How much do you know about that? So I don't want to get on my soapbox about that and try to badger you about why you should do history. But I think African Americans, before they start thinking about, badgering white people about being racist and about being discriminatory and about that, they should do a lot of history and seeing how many white people actually helped African Americans obtain a little bit of freedom that they did have, that we do have now, the rights that we do have now. Some of them went to their death, as much as we did. Some of them died right next to African Americans in order to obtain the little bit of rights that we have now. And I think it's not even a little bit of rights. I think we're pretty much on par right now. It's just there are opportunities out there, but I think we don't take advantage of those opportunities. I think we complain too much. We spend more time complaining than we do actually doing, than actually making a difference in our own areas. And you have people that would say, "Oh, you're a house nigger, you're a coon for saying something like that." Really? Okay, explain this. Mr. Black man, Mr. Black woman, Mr. Pro-Black, Mrs. Pro-Black. Why is it that these same centers these urban centers that I'm talking about have the highest rate of black-on-black crime than African Americans living in areas where white people have the highest population? Tell me that. Tell me that. Tell me, you're quick to cite people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Fred Hampton, etc., etc. But what you won't do is you won't give credit to any of those white women who passed away and who was murdered by their own kind for giving asylum or giving cover to some of those African American slaves trying to make it to Canada when they were running away, when they was runaway slaves during the